April 30th, 1943. The sun had barely broken through the mist when a Spanish fisherman named José Antonio Rey cast his nets into the calm waters off Huelva's coast. The sea that morning carried a strange stillness, the kind that makes even the most seasoned sailor hesitate before dropping anchor. Then he saw it, a figure bobbing lifelessly in the surf. The bloated body of a man, face pale as candle wax, uniform clinging to him like a second skin. The fisherman's first instinct was dread. A war was raging across Europe, and corpses in the water were not uncommon. But this one was different. He wore the insignia of a British officer, and cuffed to his wrist by a chain of polished steel was a leather briefcase. The fisherman dragged the body to shore, unaware that in his weathered hands lay one of the greatest secrets of the Second World War. The Spanish authorities were perplexed. Papers inside the briefcase were marked "Top Secret" and bore the seal of His Majesty's government. Local police, half curious and half fearful of foreign intrigue, alerted German intelligence agents stationed nearby. By nightfall, word had already reached Berlin. A high-ranking British courier had died at sea, carrying vital documents revealing Allied invasion plans. It seemed like the gods of fortune had smiled upon Hitler's Reich. But in truth, the body found off the coast of Spain was not who it seemed. In fact, the man had never lived at all. He was a fiction, carefully constructed in London's smoky backrooms by minds so desperate to save lives that they turned death itself into a weapon. To understand how this grotesque masterpiece came to be, we must step back to the weary spring of 1943. The Allies had won North Africa, but Europe remained a fortress under Nazi control. The next step was clear: invade the southern underbelly of Hitler's empire. But where? The Mediterranean was a chessboard of risk. Sicily seemed the obvious choice. It was close, strategic, and vulnerable. And because it was obvious, Hitler was certain they would land there. The British knew that if the Germans concentrated their forces on Sicily, the cost in Allied blood would be unimaginable. What they needed wasn't just soldiers or ships. They needed belief, German belief, that the invasion would strike somewhere else entirely. And so began a war fought not with guns or tanks, but with imagination and deceit. Inside the secret chambers of British naval intelligence, two officers wrestled with the impossible. Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu, a man of intellect and calm arrogance, and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley, tall, eccentric, and delightfully awkward, were tasked with designing a deception so convincing it would bend enemy strategy. "We must make them see what isn't there," Montagu reportedly told his colleagues. "And for that we'll need a man who isn't there either." It was a morbid proposition: to find a body, turn it into an officer, and plant false documents upon it to mislead the enemy. Some called it brilliant. Others called it madness. In wartime London, both words meant much the same thing. The idea was not entirely new. An earlier memo, dubbed the Trout Memo, had circulated through British intelligence months earlier, comparing deception to fishing. "The trout," it said, "bites best when he is hungry." The task now was to bait the Germans with something irresistible, a believable story wrapped in flesh and uniform. Montagu and Cholmondeley decided their phantom officer would carry invasion plans suggesting that Allied forces would land in Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. If the Germans swallowed the lie, the real invasion would face fewer defenses. But for that, the corpse had to appear utterly authentic. A real man with a real life, a past, and personal details that breathed humanity into the illusion. And so began one of the strangest preparations in military history. British intelligence scoured hospitals and morgues, searching for a suitable candidate, someone whose death could pass for drowning, whose identity could be reshaped without raising suspicion. After weeks of grim deliberation, they found him, a destitute Welshman named Cholmondeley Michael, who had died after consuming rat poison in a derelict London warehouse. A forgotten soul, invisible to the living, yet destined to deceive the mighty. His tragic end would become the beginning of Operation Mincemeat, the boldest deception of the war. In death, Cholmondeley Michael became Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The transformation was meticulous. His uniform was pressed to perfection, rank badges correctly aligned, even the lint brushed from his pockets. They gave him an identity that breathed with detail, A fiancée named Pam, whose photograph, played by a secretary from MI5, was tucked inside his wallet. Love letters, receipts, and personal trinkets were chosen with an artist's care. The illusion was so complete that even those crafting it began to feel affection for the man they had created. "He feels real now," one of the clerks whispered, placing a worn theater ticket in the corpse's pocket. "Almost too real." For Montagu and Cholmondeley, the stakes were terrifying. One slip in detail, one inconsistency in the story, and the Germans would see through the ruse. Every word in the forged letters had to be deliberate, every signature perfect. Even the briefcase that would carry the secret invasion plans had to appear as though it had survived a struggle at sea. They soaked it in salt water, scuffed the leather, and added stains of rust where the handcuff chain had rubbed against metal. In a war where millions fought on land and sea, these men fought with ink, cloth, and cunning. At times, the absurdity of their work hung over the room like cigarette smoke. They joked about holding a memorial service for their imaginary officer, half out of humor, half out of guilt. Montagu, a man rarely seen without a wry smile, told one assistant, "We're about to make history with a corpse. Let's hope it has good manners." Beneath the humor lay quiet tension. They were crafting not just a deception but a moral compromise, turning a nameless man into a tool of war. Yet in their minds, it was a necessary sin. A lie that could save tens of thousands of real lives. Outside their office, London was a city of blackouts and air raids. People slept in underground tunnels while bombs painted the night sky orange. The contrast between destruction above and deception below was striking. In the chaos of war, truth had become as fragile as glass, easily shattered and reshaped to fit necessity. Churchill himself once said, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." That single sentence became their guiding light. As the final details came together, the atmosphere grew solemn. The corpse, dressed, sealed, and prepared, lay in a coffin under refrigeration, labeled only as "materials for special operation." Montagu stood over it one last time. "Good luck, Major Martin," he murmured, his voice steady but his eyes unsteady. "May you serve your country well." Around him, the room fell silent. Even in the world of espionage, where deception was routine, this act carried a peculiar reverence. It was as if the dead man himself had been enlisted. Outside, spring was returning to London. Blossoms pushed through soot-covered branches, and the city dared to hope the war might end soon. But inside the walls of British intelligence, hope took a stranger form, a briefcase handcuffed to a corpse, a fiction sailing toward enemy lines. They had done all they could. The plan was ready. All that remained was to release their creation into the sea and pray that the enemy believed in the man who never lived. And as dawn broke on the day of departure, the men gathered quietly in the submarine bay, the air thick with salt and nerves. The coffin was lowered gently into the submarine's hold. No speeches, no farewells, just the hum of the engines and the knowledge that the fate of an invasion rested on a ghost. For Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, it was the end of preparation and the beginning of uncertainty. Somewhere between duty and morality, between truth and lies, they had crossed into a territory no map could chart. The ocean awaited, vast and indifferent, ready to carry their secret into history. But whether the enemy would believe it, that was a question no one could answer. Not yet. The body was ready, but the illusion had to breathe. The moment the submarine's hatch closed, London's spymasters could no longer adjust or perfect their creation. Every thread of uniform, every inked signature, every scrap of forged paper was now frozen in truth's opposite. Operation Mincemeat had officially left British shores, but its architects, Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley, were still haunted by what might go wrong. In the world of deception, a perfect lie was the rarest of miracles. Montagu, a barrister before the war, knew that every case could collapse under one unasked question. And now, the question belonged to the enemy. Back in the dim offices of naval intelligence, the mood oscillated between grim humor and quiet obsession. Cholmondeley, tall and perpetually disheveled, was pacing by the map wall, tracing invisible routes with his finger. His imagination, once a source of gentle amusement to his colleagues, was now their greatest weapon. He had been the first to insist that a good deception needed narrative, not just evidence. "We're not fooling machines," he had once told Montagu. "We're fooling men who want to believe they're clever." That idea had shaped everything: the forged love letters, the train ticket stub, the cheap receipt for an engagement ring tucked into the dead man's wallet. These weren't decorations. They were character notes, hints of an inner life that no enemy agent could resist piecing together. Montagu watched him, cigarette in hand, the smoke curling like a question mark above his head. His thoughts drifted back to the absurd process of building a human from paper and ink. They had crafted a life story that could withstand scrutiny from the most paranoid interrogator. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, age 34. Born in Cardiff, stationed in London. Fiancée named Pam. Fond of theater and whiskey, sloppy with receipts but dutiful with letters. Even his wallet contained a bill for a new shirt, a touch of imperfection that Montagu considered essential. "Real men make small mistakes," he said once, with half a smile. "Our corpse must do the same." There was something deeply unsettling about how easily they had turned fiction into biography. Each forged document was a thread in a web of falsehoods so intricate it bordered on art. But art, unlike war, didn't usually get people killed. Montagu knew that if the Germans saw through it, the Allies' real invasion plan, Sicily, could collapse into blood and disaster. It wasn't just a trick anymore. It was a matter of lives measured in thousands. The responsibility pressed against his ribs like the weight of the briefcase they had chained to the dead man's wrist. Days passed. The submarine carrying the body, his Seraph, crept through the Atlantic under orders of absolute secrecy. The crew knew little, only that their mission involved special cargo. When they reached the coast of Spain, they surfaced under a moonless sky. The captain, Lieutenant Jewell, performed a short prayer over the coffin before opening it. The corpse was lowered gently into the sea, face up, as if sleeping. His briefcase glimmered faintly in the dark water before drifting away. The men watched in silence, unsure whether to salute or to look away. Some later said they felt as though they were burying a comrade. In a strange sense, they were. By the time the submarine returned to port, the secret had vanished into the currents of the Mediterranean. From that point forward, everything depended on how the currents of politics and chance would carry it. The hope, perhaps the prayer, was that Spanish authorities would find the body, treat it with the ceremony due an officer, and, inevitably, pass the documents into German hands. Spain was neutral, but its officials were known to cooperate discreetly with the Nazi intelligence network. If the plan worked, the Germans would read the forged letters and redirect their armies toward Greece and Sardinia. If it failed, they might discover the forgery and fortify Sicily beyond any hope of invasion. In London, Montagu received word that the body had been found. His heart raced as he read the coded telegram. "Ewen, it's begun," Cholmondeley whispered. The excitement was tempered by dread. Too little interest from the Germans would mean the ruse had gone unnoticed. Too much scrutiny could unravel it entirely. The following days were agony. Reports trickled in through intercepted messages and diplomatic gossip. The Spanish authorities had indeed discovered the body and handed the briefcase to their naval command. German agents in Madrid were already pressing to see its contents. Montagu imagined their gloved hands unfolding the water-stained documents, squinting at the signatures, debating whether this was divine luck or British deceit. The beauty of the deception lay in its imperfections. The documents had been deliberately made slightly flawed, creased, smudged, and water-damaged, to suggest authenticity. One letter from a British general to another mentioned the supposed invasion of Greece almost casually, as if confident no one would ever read it outside official channels. "It's the small talk that sells it," Cholmondeley had insisted. "No one hides a lie inside perfect grammar." Even the love letters from Pam were written with deliberate clumsiness, sprinkled with sentimental nonsense. They made the story human. And humanity, they knew, was irresistible bait. Still, Montagu couldn't rest. He knew that intelligence officers, whether British or German, shared one fatal flaw: they distrusted everything except their own theories. For the plan to succeed, The Germans had to want to believe it. That was the true gamble. Would Hitler, with his towering paranoia, buy the story? Or would he see through the veil and tighten his defenses around Sicily? In Deception, Montagu once told his team, "We must think not as liars, but as believers." It was the hardest lesson of all. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the documents were making their way to the highest levels of command. Spanish intermediaries had copied the contents before returning the originals to the British embassy, pretending nothing had been disturbed. The ruse worked perfectly. When the papers were finally examined by German intelligence, they were declared authentic. One of Hitler's aides reportedly said, "The English would never risk a courier with false papers." The irony, of course, was that the English had risked exactly that. Back in London, confirmation came through decrypted Enigma messages. The Germans were reinforcing Greece and Sardinia, precisely as the forged letters suggested. Montagu sat at his desk, the message trembling in his hands. "They've swallowed it," he said quietly. Cholmondeley let out a long, shaky laugh, part disbelief, part relief. After months of doubt, they had tricked one of the most feared intelligence networks in history with nothing but creativity, precision, and a dead man's body. Yet victory brought no triumphal cheer. It was an odd, sober kind of success, one that relied on silence, on the absence of discovery. "History's greatest victories," Montagu murmured, "may be those no one ever learns about." Still, behind the satisfaction lingered unease. They had turned deception into salvation, but also into an art of moral compromise. Every life saved in Sicily would come at the price of lives lost elsewhere. German soldiers misled by the lie, civilians caught in bombings meant for phantom targets. Cholmondeley, for all his wit, sometimes stared blankly at the files, whispering, "We made ghosts to kill ghosts." Montagu rarely replied. The only way to endure such thoughts was to drown them in pragmatism. War, after all, had made philosophers of men who never wanted to think so deeply. As spring turned to early summer, the invasion plans for Sicily advanced rapidly under the cover of this deception. Operation Mincemeat was a success on paper, but no one dared to celebrate until boots hit the beaches. Montagu kept the original, Major Martin, documents locked in a safe, as if proximity to them might somehow guarantee their continued magic. Each night, he walked the quiet corridors of the Admiralty, feeling both pride and guilt intertwine. "He's done his duty," he thought of the dead man. "And he'll never know." The war raged on, indifferent to the ironies of its own theater. Yet within the walls of British intelligence, something had shifted. They had proven that imagination could win battles as effectively as artillery. Still, even as Montagu gazed at the success reports, he could not shake one thought. What if the enemy discovered the ruse before the invasion began? The illusion was strong, but like all illusions, it existed only in the mind of the believer. One leak, one letter out of place, and the entire plan would disintegrate. For now, the lie held firm. The body of Major William Martin rested beneath Spanish soil, his grave adorned with flowers and honors he would never claim. But the real story, the truth behind the fiction, remained sealed in classified silence. Montagu and Cholmondeley had written a ghost into history. And somewhere across the Mediterranean, German divisions were moving toward the wrong shores, preparing to fight an enemy who would never come. The trap was set. The question was no longer whether the Germans would believe it. The question was how long the lie could live before the truth rose to the surface. The submarine had done its work and vanished beneath the waves, but the sea had just begun to tell its lie. The body of Major William Martin drifted toward the Spanish coast, cradled by the tide, its purpose unfolding with each gentle current. When local fishermen discovered it, they saw not the hand of destiny but the simple tragedy of war. They lifted him carefully from the water, the chain-bound briefcase still clutched to his wrist, and laid him on the beach beneath a rising sun. Word spread quickly through Huelva. Within hours, police, naval officers, and curious onlookers gathered, unaware that they stood at the epicenter of a deception that would echo across continents. The Spanish authorities followed protocol, notifying the British consulate about the dead officer. Meanwhile, German agents, already well entrenched in Spain's so-called neutrality, caught wind of the discovery. To them, opportunity smelled as sharp as salt. They pressured Spanish officials for access to the body and, more importantly, the briefcase. Britain's ambassador in Madrid, Sir Samuel Hoare, found himself performing a delicate dance of diplomacy. He had to appear desperate to retrieve the documents, but not so desperate as to arouse suspicion that they were fake. In war, acting was as vital a weapon as artillery. While these small performances unfolded in Spain, the architects of the ruse waited in London, suspended between hope and dread. Every hour felt like an eternity stretched thin by silence. Montagu, whose calm demeanor had carried the operation through its creation, now found patience his enemy. Each intercepted German telegram that crossed his desk was a thread of evidence, but none yet confirmed belief. "If they don't bite soon," he told Cholmondeley, "we've sent a dead man to sea for nothing." His words carried no anger, only exhaustion, the kind born of moral strain and sleepless nights. But the Germans did bite. Reports began filtering in through diplomatic whispers. The Spanish, after initial hesitation, had allowed German agents to examine the contents of the briefcase. The deception was unfolding exactly as planned. The documents, water-stained, partially illegible and maddeningly authentic, were copied and sent to Berlin. British intelligence intercepted messages hinting at feverish discussions among Hitler's staff. The Major Martin papers had been elevated to the highest levels of Nazi command. For Montagu and his team, the tension became almost unbearable. They had built their lie to live only as long as belief sustained it. Now, belief rested in the mind of Adolf Hitler himself. Far away in his bunker, Hitler studied the reports with the obsessive suspicion that marked his leadership. The documents suggested that the Allies would strike Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. His generals, cautious and analytical, debated endlessly, weighing logic against intuition. Sicily, they argued, was still the most probable target. Yet Hitler's paranoia, sharpened by years of deceit and betrayal, led him to see the false as truth and the truth as a trap. "The English are too clever to do the obvious," he told them. "Their invasion will not come through Sicily." It was precisely the reaction Montagu had hoped for. The trap had worked because it exploited not Hitler's ignorance, but his intelligence. In London, confirmation came through the breaking of Enigma codes, messages encrypted by the German military and now read in secret by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. The decrypted lines were clinical and cold. German forces were reinforcing Greece and Sardinia, repositioning aircraft, and withdrawing divisions from Sicily. The scale of the deception's success was staggering. Montagu read the transcript twice, scarcely believing it. "He's done it," he said softly, referring to their fabricated major. "He's fooled them all." Cholmondeley, standing nearby, allowed himself a rare grin. "Then the man who never lived," he said, "has just won a battle." Operation Mincemeat had exceeded even Churchill's expectations. When the Prime Minister received word of the German troop movements, he reportedly remarked, "Mincemeat swallowed whole." The humor masked a grim satisfaction. Behind that quiet success lay the reality of what was at stake. The Allies were preparing for their invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, a massive amphibious assault involving more than 160,000 men. If the Germans had guessed correctly, the beaches would have become graveyards. Instead, as the Allies landed in July 1943, they faced only fragmented resistance. Hitler's divisions, spread thin across the Mediterranean, could not respond swiftly. The invasion succeeded, paving the way for the fall of Mussolini and Italy's surrender within months. The cost of this triumph, however, could not be measured in strategy alone. For those who had built the lie, victory carried a strange melancholy. Montagu received reports from Spain detailing the burial of Major William Martin. The man who had never lived was given full military honors. A priest read verses over his coffin. Spanish sailors stood in solemn salute. Flowers were laid on his grave. Montagu read these details in silence, feeling both pride and unease. The deception had required him to craft not just a false life, but a false death, and now even the burial was genuine. The irony was too sharp to escape him. "We made a man out of nothing," he murmured, and now the world mourns him. As news of the operation's success spread quietly through the corridors of British intelligence, the participants carried themselves with a peculiar restraint. They had achieved the impossible, yet none could speak of it. Official secrecy demanded silence. The truth would remain buried for decades. Only within their small circle could they acknowledge what they had done. Montagu kept the personal effects of Major Martin locked away in a drawer, Pam's photograph, the love letters, the ticket stub. "He deserves to rest," he said, as if speaking of a real comrade. Cholmondeley, ever the dreamer, replied, "He already has more peace than the rest of us." For Montagu, the operation had been an intellectual triumph but a moral labyrinth. He could justify the lie by its results, the thousands of soldiers who would live because of it, but the human element remained impossible to shake. He often wondered about Jean-W. Michael, the man whose body had carried the deception. Michael had died nameless, alone, forgotten. Yet in death, he had been given a purpose grander than any he might have imagined in life. Was it redemption or exploitation? Montagu wasn't sure. "We gave him a story," he once said, "but not a voice." The admission carried a quiet guilt that would follow him long after the war ended. The deeper irony of the operation was how thoroughly it mirrored the war itself. Every nation fought not only with weapons but with illusions, propaganda, secrecy, and stories told to keep morale alive. Operation Mincemeat was simply the purest distillation of that truth. It transformed imagination into strategy, deceit into salvation. Yet even success left a residue of unease. Montagu's reports were clinical, devoid of emotion, but between the lines lay the exhaustion of a man who had glimpsed how fragile truth could be. As the invasion of Sicily rolled forward, Allied newspapers celebrated the victory without knowing its secret architect. To the public, it was the result of courage, planning, and brute force. The silent men in London who had written it into existence remained ghosts in their own right, watching history unfold from the shadows. Churchill moved on to new fronts, new operations, new deceptions. Montagu, though hailed privately, felt a quiet emptiness. The success of Mincemeat could never be spoken of, not yet. It was a triumph built to vanish, a story that could not be told. Still, one truth offered a measure of comfort. The body they had sent to sea, a man who had died forgotten, had changed the course of a global war. He had been used, yes, but also honored. His false identity had become his monument. In a war of lies, Montagu later reflected, perhaps the greatest truth is found in the sacrifice of the unknown. It was his way of reconciling with what he had done, though the unease never fully left him. By the time summer's end painted the skies over London with orange haze, the Allies controlled Sicily. Hitler's armies reeled from the blow, too slow to realize how cleverly they had been misled. Operation Mincemeat had worked to perfection. Yet for those who had crafted it, victory felt curiously hollow. They had won through deceit, saved lives through manipulation, and blurred forever the line between right and necessary. The world would never know the corpse that fooled an empire, or the men who built his legend. But as Montagu stood alone one evening, reading the decrypted German dispatches one last time, he smiled faintly. "He played his part," he said aloud. "Now he deserves his rest." Outside, the city exhaled beneath the weight of victory, its streets humming with cautious relief. Yet in the quiet offices of intelligence, another story waited to surface, the story of the real man beneath the myth. Jean-W. Michael, the forgotten soul from a derelict London building, had done what no living soldier could. He had deceived Hitler himself. But the truth of who he was, and the strange redemption hidden in his fate, would not be known for decades. For now, the world believed in Major William Martin, Royal Marines, a man who never existed, yet had changed everything. The rain began again over London, fine and relentless, tapping softly against the office window where Ewen Montagu sat, staring at the worn photograph of the man who had saved an invasion by dying twice, once in life and once in fiction. Months had passed since Operation Mincemeat's success, yet the victory that had shifted the war's tide now lingered like a ghost in Montagu's conscience. His colleagues had moved on, consumed by new operations, new deceptions, but he could not. For every secret one, a shadow remained. He had come to understand that war was not only about killing and surviving, it was about the stories men chose to believe. The file before him bore a name that had never truly existed: Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Officially, Martin's body rested under a white cross in the Spanish soil of Huelva, honored by the enemy and remembered by the Allies. But Montagu knew the truth beneath the lie. The man in that grave was Ewen Michael, a Welsh drifter who had died forgotten in a city basement. The thought had begun to gnaw at him in the quiet hours. Ewen had no family, no one to mourn him, yet his fabricated life had earned the kind of immortality heroes could only dream of. That paradox haunted Montagu. The line between righteousness and exploitation blurred more each day, and he began to wonder if, in creating Major Martin, they had become gods or grave robbers. Late one evening, as he packed his briefcase to leave the Admiralty, Montagu found a sealed envelope on his desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, and deliberate. Inside was a photograph, a Spanish newspaper clipping of Major Martin's grave, adorned with fresh flowers. Scrawled on the back were 4 words: "He saved many lives." There was no signature, no indication of its sender. For a moment, Montagu felt an odd warmth. Someone in Spain, perhaps one of the locals who had buried the body, had chosen to remember him not as a tool of deception but as a man worth honoring. It was the first time in months Montagu felt that the lie might have given something true back to the world. But the war had not ended, and neither had deception. The Germans were retreating, but the cost of each advance weighed heavier. London remained under blackout, air raid sirens still haunted the night. Within the intelligence community, whispers of new plans circulated, operations even more intricate, more morally entangled. Montagu, though lauded privately, began to feel the cost of what they had done. The office buzzed with men who spoke of statistics and strategy, yet none spoke of conscience. He would pass them in the corridor, clerks, officers, codebreakers, all haunted in their own way, all wearing the same quiet fatigue. One night, as Montagu left the Admiralty, he found Charles Cholmondeley waiting outside, umbrella tilted against the drizzle. They hadn't spoken at length since Mincemeat. "You look older," Cholmondeley said, half smiling. "Victory doesn't suit you?" Montagu chuckled weakly. "Perhaps it's the kind of victory we had to buy." They walked together down Whitehall, the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire punctuating the night. Cholmondeley had always been the dreamer, the imaginative architect of impossible ideas. Yet even he looked different, tired, quieter, stripped of his eccentric confidence. "Do you ever think about him?" Montagu asked suddenly. "About Michael?" Cholmondeley's eyes flickered, uncertain. "Every day," he said softly. "But I prefer to think of him as Martin. He's earned that name now." Their footsteps echoed as they walked, and the silence between them carried more weight than words could. Each knew that their operation had changed the course of the war. Yet both understood that history would never know them, nor the man who had made their lie possible. "Perhaps it's better this way," Cholmondeley said at last. "Every war hero deserves a grave, even if his name is borrowed." Montagu nodded but said nothing. The months that followed were marked by unease. Rumors reached London that the Germans had begun investigating the deception, piecing together fragments that hinted at the truth. Montagu dismissed most as paranoia, but one cable from British agents in Madrid unsettled him deeply. German intelligence had ordered the exhumation of Major Martin's body. The news hit him like a physical blow. Everything, the months of planning, the perfection of the details, the secrecy, could unravel if the truth emerged. He spent sleepless nights imagining the consequences. The man who had fooled Hitler could not now be exposed as a fraud. The entire operation's legacy would collapse into disgrace. Days turned into weeks without confirmation. Then, just as quietly as the rumor had arrived, it vanished. A second message confirmed that the Germans had abandoned their investigation, convinced the documents had been genuine. Relief washed over Montagu, but it came with a chill. He realized how fragile truth was, how easily belief could be manipulated, and how even after the war, such tools could be misused. As 1944 turned toward its bloody summer, the Allies stormed Normandy, pushing into France. London erupted in cautious celebration, but Montagu found himself detached. The war that had begun as a moral crusade now felt like a tapestry of hidden lies. He'd seen too many invisible victories bought with invisible prices. Still, one evening he received an unexpected visitor. A naval courier delivered a parcel bearing the Admiralty's seal. Inside lay a medal, the Order of the British Empire, and a short note signed by Churchill himself, for services rendered to victory with quiet brilliance and courage. Montagu held the medal in his hand, its gleam catching the lamplight, and felt a strange hollowness. Courage, he thought, was not the absence of fear but the willingness to live with what fear had forced you to do. The medal meant recognition, yet it also chained him to the deception forever. He placed it in his desk drawer beside the photograph of Major Martin and closed it gently. Some truths were not meant to be displayed. But history, like the sea that had carried their creation to Spain, has a way of uncovering its secrets. After the war ended, rumors of the operation began to surface. Reporters whispered of a man who fooled Hitler. Books speculated about the greatest deception of the century. Montagu, bound by secrecy, could say nothing. Yet he read those accounts with quiet fascination. The world was trying to reconstruct a puzzle it didn't even know existed. He imagined W. Michael's name buried beneath those headlines, the real man still invisible behind the myth. It wasn't until years later, long after the guns had gone silent, that Montagu returned to Spain. He stood by the grave of Major William Martin, where the flowers still bloomed in careful rows. The epitaph read simply, "Greater love hath no man than this." Montagu knelt, brushing the stone with his fingertips. "We gave you a name," he whispered, "and the world gave you immortality." His voice broke slightly. "I only hope you've forgiven us for how we used you." The wind moved softly through the cemetery, carrying with it the murmur of distant waves, the same tide that had borne the body ashore years before. As he rose to leave, Montagu noticed something new at the base of the grave, a small wooden cross, freshly placed, with a note pinned beneath it. The handwriting was delicate, in Spanish, for the English officer who saved our sons. He stood in silence, understanding at last that the lie had become larger than its creators. It had given meaning to strangers, hope to those who needed it. Perhaps, he thought, that was the strange mercy of war. Even deceit could sometimes serve truth. That night, back at his hotel, Montagu wrote a letter to Cholmondeley. He spoke of the grave, of the cross, of the way the lie had taken on a life of its own. He ended it with a single line. "We gave him a story, but the world gave him peace." When he finished, he folded the letter neatly, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it with care, as though sealing away the final chapter of his own guilt. Years later, when the operation was finally declassified and the truth of Major William Martin's identity made public, historians called it one of the greatest deceptions in history. But for Montagu, it remained something far more personal, a confession written across time. In the final years of his life, he would often return to the photograph that had begun it all, the smiling young woman pretending to be the love of a man who never existed. It reminded him that even the smallest details could change the course of nations. As he grew old and the memories of war blurred into the quiet of peace, Montagu came to accept that history is a kind of fiction, one written by those who survive it. Operation Mincemeat had been more than a trick, it had been a story crafted to save lives, and in doing so, it had revealed the deepest truth of war itself, that sometimes, the only way to win is to make the world believe a beautiful lie. And in that lie, one forgotten man had found the purpose he never had in life, a final redemption beneath the waves. If you've made it this far into the story, thank you for watching and taking this journey through one of World War II's most secret and extraordinary operations. Stories like this remind us how courage, deception, and sacrifice shaped history in ways few ever knew. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to uncover more hidden chapters from the past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another untold story from the war. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story surprised you the most? Do you think Operation Mincemeat was justified, or was it too great a moral cost for victory? Your comments and support help us keep history alive. Until next time, this is the Forgotten War Stories, signing off.